Welcome back to the Rules of Engagement. Before we jump into our second segment, let me remind you guys, if you miss any of the content we do here at Major League Gaming, or of course if you want to catch up, you're just trying to find a good tournament, nothing on live at the moment, everything we do here is at YouTube for free in 1080p quality, youtube.com/official. MLGSC2, every WCS match, plays of the day, Rules of Engagement, the Winter Championship, so much great content. Go ahead, check it out again. URL is youtube.com/official. MLGSC2. So our second segment is going to be, again, Snute, this time in his winner's match against Alicia. And we're talking about positional ZvP. This is the second game. He had lost the first one, so he's down 0-1. We're talking about early zealot pressure from a Protoss and kind of the goal of it and what it can do. We'll talk about optimally defending different three-base push in this case. Basically, but how to construct an optimal defense in almost any situation. A couple key things to look for. And then we're going to talk about how to play to the map and try to take the map into account as you use your tactics. So we're starting this game off at the 7-minute mark. And the one thing we're going to take a look at is, of course, Alicia did this gateway expansion, right, which is one of the more common builds if you've been watching professional Starcraft, which you probably have if you're watching the show. You have noticed a lot of Protoss have been doing a gateway expand against Zerg lately. One awesome thing about the gateway expand is it allows you to warp gate very fast. Of course, your opponent typically gets Zergling speed before they get the third hatchery if they see the gateway expansion, which means they're going to have map control with their speedings, right? There's not much Protoss can do at the 7-minute mark to beat this many speedings. But if you can hide pylons, if your opponent isn't able to scout those pylons, you can sneak them around on the map. Even if your opponent has map control, if you can keep that pylon hidden until you get about 6 to 9 zealots, somewhere in that range, all of a sudden it's very, very hard for your opponent to defend efficiently with just speedings, right? I mean, yes, speedings can beat these guys. They don't have +1 attack, but your opponent doesn't really have enough larvae to make that many speedings very quickly. So if they want to make a defense, they either have to get a Roach Warren very early, which is almost as painful as getting 30 to 40 speedings very early, or they basically have to just pull the drones in and take bad trades. Right now, Snute ideally wants to be making drones. Instead, he's making nothing but speedings, and in fact, he's losing many drones as well here to these zealots. Time warp going down, so the queen's going to fall as well. Basic idea is if your opponent doesn't scout this early pylon, you don't have to do a gateway all-in. Just warp it in a bunch of zealots, waiting to have between 6 and 9. Same them at your opponent's third can allow you to do a ton of damage. Right now, we can see Snute here is at 50 drones. Ideally, he'd be at 60 to 70 at this point, and he may even lose more drones against these zealots here. At the very least, losing speedlings. Lair tech has just started at the 9-minute mark, when really, ideally, it should be started over a minute ago. So while he does save the third base, you can see there he's lost 13 drones in the process, and of course, he's delayed his tech. So very, very strong to get these early pylons against your opponent. If they miss-scout them, you can do insane, insane damage. As a Protoss player, always go ahead and know that it's most important in case you need a gateway expand. But anytime if you're going to have a couple gateways already, just part of your build, you want to get a bunch of gateways to be safe early, go ahead and try to set up those proxy pylons to catch your opponent off guard with a whole bunch of cells. So now we're going to see the Protoss will be playing from ahead. It's going to go to a pretty standard game. As soon as he has about 6 or 7 gateway units, he's going to move to take a third base. He's, of course, going Colossi Void Rays behind us with the most standard Protoss combinations. And he's going to posture with his army out of the middle of the map to try to make sure he can defend the area between his second and third base. Now, it can be a little risky to do this, which is why you always have to have your Mothership Core with your army. If you want to do a little type of semi-aggressive pushes to force your opponent to make units, always have that Mothership Core with the army. You can go in, delay the creep spread, even kill creep tumor 2, and then back away or recall if there's too many units. If there's not, you can get a couple kills, get some damage done, and then as your sentries run low on force fields, as your Mothership Core, in fact, he actually lost a Mothership Core, which is really bad because if Snute, for example, had 40 more speedings right now, they would just run in and surround the Protoss army. As is, Alicia, can back away before these units come out, so it worked out okay. Just a little bit of light pressure, using the recall to keep it safe. Unfortunately, he did end up losing the Mothership Core, but he was able to back out before Snute could have enough units to punish him. So now we're going to see it's going to be 3 base to a Zerg taking a 4th base. Economies are pretty standard for what you see at this point of the game. 65 drones to 67 probes to 77 drones. But the important factor is the Zerg Hive tech is very delayed. This type of build, the Zerg typically wants to start Hive at the latest at about 11 minutes, the very latest, if they're trying to do a Roach Hydra Infestor play. Or sorry, Roach Hydra Viper to get those Vipers down time. So the fact that the Hive isn't going to be done until about 14:30 It's about 2 minutes late, and that's going to leave a nice window for the Protoss to hit before Vipers can come out. So we can fast forward a little bit here. We can see that's exactly what happens. Alicia's going to move out here and push towards this Zerg base. And now, Snute's in a very awkward position. If you look at this battle, he's fighting the unit composition of 3 Colossi, 2 Void Rays. Those aren't too important. But it's really 3 Colossi, 6 Sentries, and then a bunch of Stalkers. But 6 Sentries is a lot of force fields. 3 Colossi with Thermal Lance is a lot of damage. And all he has, from the Zerg point of view, is 16 Hydralisks, 3 Roaches, 37 Speedings, 2 Infested. So basically just a bunch of Hydralisks. What's really important here is trying to make a scrappy defense when ideally these Vipers would be out in the battle, could abduct the Colossi, and then your Hydras could be effective. Now he's got to find a different way to make the Hydras effective, which means keeping them alive. So the first part to keeping them alive is making sure they don't get segmented by force fields. So if you can see here, that's the first thing he does, is he says, okay, if my opponent is going to be coming through this location right here, pushing for the main army this way, and I want to make sure that my army is as spread around as possible so I don't get nailed by too many force fields. I don't want to be fighting a straight line where you can cut off 6, 7, 8 Hydras at a time, kill those Hydralisks while the rest of the army is stuck behind force fields. What he wants to do is make us Hydralisks a single layer of Hydralisks in as spread out a formation as possible. So that's exactly why you see these units coming down here, these units split up here, and ideally he'd even split them up a few more to get them, you know, all basically entire arc of Zerg across this entranceway. And if you have that entire arc, it makes it much, much more difficult for Protoss to find a way to force field units in order such that a couple units are stuck towards the Protoss army and the rest is behind force fields. If their units are 1 deep, you can't cut the row in half because it's only a single row of units, which means you have to try to find a way to make some like diagonal force field lines and try to push units around with force fields, which is much more difficult, and on the fly it's very, very hard. So the first step is setting up that beautiful concave where he's going to have the advantage dealing with the force fields. The second step is, as we go forward in this, what we're going to notice is that he needs to make sure that Colossi aren't doing much damage to his Hydras. So the first step to doing that is making sure Hydras don't get pinned in by force fields. Notice how he's been able to avoid these force fields very well so far. And then the second part of that is going to make sure there's always something taking the hits from the Colossi that's not the Hydras, or at the very worst, only a single Hydras. And what does that mean? Well, it means once these Speedings are all dead and his drone count starts getting low, he needs to buy more time for the Vipers, he has to find another thing to pull, and that's, of course, is going to be the drones here. You can see here, the Speedings, as they're dying, the Roaches start to die, he needs to pull the drones. And why does he have to pull the drones here? Well, he has 2 options. He can pull the drones now, and while the drones die, the Hydralisks are killing a lot of the Protoss meat, so that once all the drones are dead, we can see here he's actually up to 30 drone deaths. He had 12 before, so he's lost 18 drones in this battle. But once the drones are dead, there's not that much Protoss meat anymore, and there's still plenty of Hydralisks left to kill the Colossus. On the other hand, his other option was to not pull the drones, and instead of losing 20 drones, he would have lost 10 Hydralisks. It's about the same life, that ratio. And if you lose 10 Hydralisks, then you're stuck fighting that Protoss army with an army that consists of 4 Hydras and 14 Roaches, and then you're going to realize that you can't beat that, you're just going to lose the game. So if you're going to pull drones, if you realize that you have to pull drones, probes, SCVs, whatever worker it is to win the battle, if you have to do that, you need to do it as soon as possible. So it's very important to do what Snute did, is recognize a situation where you're not going to win without a little bit of workers take the hits, and then pull those workers as soon as possible. This is true for a Terran player playing against one-base Blink Stalker attack. If you wait to pull SCVs so you have no Marines, SCVs on their own are going to do nothing against Blink Stalkers. But if they're distracting the Stalkers while Marines behind are shooting, all of a sudden you can make that defense happen. Same thing here. Drones on their own can't do anything. Drones tanking with Hydras doing damage behind them, all of a sudden that is a defense that's doable. Of course, it's still not ideal, but it's better to be sub-ideal than losing the game. So when you have the Vipers like this as Snute, you want to go in there and just try to pick off some of the key units. He's seen if he can do damage on a counterattack. Why is he trying to do damage on a counter? Well, current situation is he knows he lost a bunch of drones. He knows his opponent's on 3 bases. He's a little bit behind in economy. And he says, I need to try to make something happen before my opponent gets High Templar to deal with these Vipers. Try to get a few cost-efficient engagements, pick off some high-tech units, maybe look for a window. Because I know if we build just macro up and he gets Templar and I just get more Roach Hydra, I'm going to be in a bad situation because he has same economy and a more superior army. So what we see here is just a Blink Stalker's trying to be annoying. With Blink, of course, he's not looking for a battle, just seeing if he could snipe a Viper, Infest, or a key unit and get out of there. Now going forward, we're on Neoplanet S, and this is where it's important to start playing to the map. So the Zerg player, ideally what you want to do is you want to deny all map vision from your opponent. Same thing with a Protoss player, you want to kill the creep tumors, make sure there's a minimum number of Zerg units on the map. Denying vision is so important on Neoplanet S because if your opponent doesn't know which way around the map you're going, they're not going to be in position to defend. So right here, Snute, of course, he didn't have the Overseer with his army, unfortunately, so this Observer was able to keep track of him. And when that Observer could keep track of him, all of a sudden we can see here Alicia is in a very good position. Right? Of course, Snute can get a decent concave, but as Alicia micros backwards into battle, his Colossi aren't easy to abduct with the Vipers. There's Stalkers and Templar in front of him. Not a great engagement for Snute, so he's going to head up here. But now Alicia can chase him, and it's still not a bad engagement. It's pretty much a one-directional engagement. It's not bad for the Zerg. It's not bad for the Protoss. It's a pretty even engagement. And Alicia was able to get that even engagement because even though this is a tough map to get good engagements as a Protoss player on, he knew the Zerg army was coming from this direction, so he could kind of hide in the corner, hope Snute would engage him, and then when he didn't, he just chases him, and they're in a strict one-way fight. Another trait goes down. Both players losing some of the key tech units, Templars, a couple of the Colossi going down, but all the Vipers and Infestors going down as well, and with 3 more Colossi, of course, Snute has it. He's going to turn around and fight, and that's kind of a bit of a bad trade here. He's just trading a little bit poorly because he's fighting Colossi without a real way to counter them, and that's going to result in him losing the map control, losing his gold base. But now, as I talked about playing to the map again, of course, Snute is going to try to do the same thing. Now he's going to have to wait to rebuild these Vipers and get some energy, but the most important thing here is to try to deny your opponent's vision around the map. So as we go forward in this, we can see is that Alicia doesn't really have any map vision. Now that's partly because this Observer, I missed that this Observer did get sniped off by the Overseer. And then Overseer died to the Blink Stalkers. So he did lose this one Observer, and because he's been losing Colossi all the game to abducts and he only has 1 robotics, he hasn't felt comfortable replacing the Observers. So of course, Alicia knows that he needs to know which direction his opponent's attacking, and he puts his Zealot here, and he meant to put this other Zealot on this path. But unfortunately, he actually accidentally put them both on a top path, which means this is dark. Of course, that's not exactly what Alicia wants. He's also going to send this other Observer to keep an eye on this path, and his army positioned because maybe there's Zerg coming out across the bottom. But unfortunately, what he doesn't know, because this cell wasn't doing his job, is that Snute is here on the top path. And this is what's so important, is that if you can catch your opponent off guard, then all of a sudden the positioning is going to be very favorable to you if you do it correctly. Now, if Snute just walked in here, killed this Nexus, then all of a sudden his army is... let's just actually use some of the... we'll talk about this, but let's say Snute did what a lot of Zerg players would do, right? Where he just comes in here and his army just walks over here and he goes and he kills this Nexus, right? Then yes, he kills a base. But because his army's right here, all of a sudden it's just roughly an even engagement. The Protoss army can just kind of walk up the map here and they're basically fighting, army versus army in a straight line. It's going to come down to Viper versus Templar positioning. Protoss has a slight advantage because if we look at the army size here, we can see, let me get back in the game. If we look at the army size here, we can see that the Protoss actually has a little bit better of an army. Cost-wise, they're slightly ahead, but unit compositionally, the Protoss opponent has mostly Colossi Templar versus a very Roach-heavy composition from the Zerg. So that gives a slight advantage to the Zerg player. If it was that straight line engagement when the armies are super important. But what Snute does is he sends a small force here to attack the Nexus, knowing that, okay, this will put pressure on the Protoss player to send his whole army. If it comes up from the bottom, it's going to come up this way, right? And as it comes up this way, that's where, instead of having my whole army in a blob to just kill the Nexus, maybe I won't kill the Nexus, but I can have my army come in from here and all of a sudden have a great concave. Or even if it's not, even if he doesn't want to expose this army here to being flanked, he can do something like just make a giant concave right here and kind of come in from all directions. The other big aspect is that he forces his opponent to come in and hurry because they think they can defend a Nexus. They think this is a small harass force. All of a sudden, units get spread out. Right? Stalkers, movement speed 2.9 are going to be in the lead. They can't do anything against Roach Hydra on their own. The Colossi, movement speed 2.25, going to be a little behind. And most importantly, those High Templar, movement speed 1.88, very slow units. They're going to be dragging into back. And as they're dragging into back coming up through this way, your Vipers all of a sudden can do a lot of damage. And that's what we're going to see here as the battle commences. Snute with a small force here, distracting, going for this Nexus. The army's coming up Stalkers, Colossi, then the High Templar. And because of the situation, not only does Snute have a decent concave, but most importantly with the Templar in the back, he knows Templar coming up in the back this way. So what I do is pull the Vipers to the left side of the battle, then he can go ahead and snag all those Colossi before the Templar come into play. And even though a couple of Colossi are getting away, forcing to snag him again, one Viper has 2 abducts, so as long as they have as many Vipers or close to as many as Colossi, you can take those out easily. And then yes, the Nexus is still alive. If he just went straight for the Nexus, he could have killed it. But you know what? If I was a Zerg player, I'd rather kill their army than win the game than kill their one Nexus, which of course, you can finish off whenever you want, so it's kind of, you probably would have normally left 1 or 2 roaches there. But going forward, I mean, the game's over, right? It's 200 food to 93. No area of effect damage from the Protoss opponent. Snute goes ahead and takes that game. So a couple things that are really cool there. Is basically from the start, Snute fell pretty far behind because he didn't scout thoroughly enough for those early proxy pylons. So as a Protoss opponent, if you get those pylons up, go ahead and harass with Zealots. Wait for about 6 to 9 Zealots. If your opponent just has speedlings, you'll be pretty cost efficient. The Zerg player, be very diligent in scouting for those proxy pylons. You really don't want to let those get up close to your third base. Next thing is also maximize use of those concaves. So you can see here, Snute was able to make a defense of his third against an attack that had 3 Colossi and 6 Sentries with pretty much just Hydratus by having a great concave to burn out the force fields and also knowing when he had to pull drones, pulling the drones before his army lost the battle. Because if your army loses the battle, then you pull drones, all of a sudden they're civilians fighting on their own. They don't work so well. They need some military leadership, the Hydratus behind them, laying down some fire. And of course, the last thing is try to make sure to attack where your opponent is weakest. Use the map to your advantage. So if you're playing on map Neoplanet X, Cloud Kingdom, any map with multiple routes around it, if you deny your opponent map vision, if you can identify where their army is likely to be, attack where it isn't, know the direction they're going to come from to try to get to defend that point, and you can set up a secure position and take a great engagement like Snute did during a game that he was probably technically losing right before the last engagement. I mean, they were both pretty much maxed out, 4 base versus 4 base. The Protoss had a better tech in the long run with Colossi, Templar, and Void Rays versus primarily Roach Hydra, which is light Viper support. So using a technique like that to get a superior position can turn you a game that you're slightly losing into all of a sudden instantly one game. This wraps up our second segment. We'll take a short break and be right on to our third segment, another Game 3 between Snute and Alicia. This time I'm going to talk about how Vipers are pretty awesome units we saw in this game. We'll see it again in Game number 3.